Welcome back. Well, it was another week, another executive order coming from the White House. This one having to do with elections, and it could lead to a pretty big overhaul. President Donald Trump signing the order that would require different federal agencies to change rules to make it so you have to show proof of citizenship when you initially register to vote. Joining us now to break down this order and why there's some pretty clear opposition to it is Ed Yonka with the Illinois ACLU. Thank you so much for joining us, Ed.
Well, thank you, Cole. Good to be here.
So I just laid out what the order was actually about. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say you're not a very big fan of this. Is that fair?
That would be a very fair read of our position. I think, this is an order that really overextends in a couple of different ways in terms of, number one, purporting to demand that every state across the union follow the precepts of Donald Trump in terms of voter registration. And those precepts, of course, are based on a lie. His lie is that somehow non-citizens are voting at some enormous rate, and therefore we need to change our system. That people who have looked at this seriously recognize that this is not an issue. When it is an issue, it is challenged and quickly found. But actually, the order and the way that the president would go about this could end up disenfranchising millions of people. And the second part of it, which I think is equally as important, is, would suggest that from henceforth, people would not be, or the local jurisdictions would not be able to count ballots, mail-in ballots or absentee ballots that come in after Election Day, even if they're postmarked before that day. That's not something, many states have different rules about the way that works. Illinois is one that happens to count those afterwards. That serves a number of different people, not the least of whom are soldiers and sailors who are serving overseas. And I don't think we should be in the business of disenfranchising those folks as well.
So when it comes to that disenfranchising effort, there's a lot of people who will see an order like this and think, okay, what's the big deal if I have to prove my citizenship in that way? So what is it about these particular kinds of orders? Voter ID laws have been passed in certain states. They've been talked about even here in the Illinois Capitol going back years now. So what is it about whether it be a proof of citizenship or providing a registered form of ID at the polls that does lead to that disenfranchisement?
The fundamental document that proves one's citizenship is a birth certificate. And two things about a birth certificate. Number one, for millions of Americans don't have access to their birth certificate and actually wouldn't even know how to go about getting it. And so if they had to, or couldn't afford the cost of going to get it. So in other words, in that instance, we're creating a poll tax for somebody to be able to participate in the electoral process. The other thing that the order specifically notes is that, and this is in some legislation that Republicans are putting forward in Washington, D.C. as well, is that the name on the birth certificate would have to match the name on the voter registration list. And if one thinks about just the millions of Americans who say, for example, women who have gotten married and changed their name, but not gone back and changed the name on their birth certificate because that's not something that they do, this could actually set those people up for a challenge as to whether or not they can participate in the system. So this is even more onerous and more dangerous than voter ID laws in terms of the number of people who could be impacted.
This obviously, there's the conversation about the voter ID law aspect of it, or the voter ID aspect of this, the proof of citizenship aspect. And then there's what you talked about at the beginning, another attempt to, I'll say, test the limits of executive power. This is clearly going to be challenged in the courts, much like so many of the other orders that we've seen come from the Trump administration so far. A lot of them have been efforts to complete agenda items without any sort of legislative input in this. Just from the broad outlook of this, how concerning is it that this continues to be tested in this way by this administration?
Yeah, Cole, I think that is the most dangerous thing in many ways, is the way in which the administration continues to pretend that the president signing a piece of paper creates the law. You know, and I'll just say, you may have remembered recently in Springfield when there was a press conference held, including by a number of Illinois legislators, where there was discussion about the president's executive orders around transgender use of restrooms and locker rooms in public schools. And somebody made the comment that, quote, Illinois isn't following the law. And the legislators just all nodded their heads. What Donald Trump says is not the law in Illinois. The law in Illinois is what we have passed through the small d democratic process. And I think one of the dangers is on this particular order is, as we look forward to, you know, critical local elections next week in Illinois, is that people will actually think, well, maybe I can't vote if I can't prove that I'm a citizen, if I don't have my birth certificate, or if that name's different in some ways. These things are simply pieces of paper. They are not the law. And I think the dangerous part is that people have become conditioned to think that there's a permission structure to operate as though what orders or edicts come down from the White House are somehow the law of the land.
I spoke with some Republican representatives about this specific order this week, and I talked about this issue or the continuing testing of the executive powers, and they described it as the process. You know, it goes to the courts. If the courts shut it down, it gets shut down, and then it doesn't happen. And that's just how this process that's been operating for hundreds of years at this point is designed to work. And I'm curious, from your perspective, from an organization that knows its way around a courtroom, what you think when you hear that specific argument, that this is the process on the way that it's being challenged in the courtrooms.
So I think there's a couple of things about that. To be sure, you know, as you say, the ACLU, we worked in and out of courtrooms for any number of years, you know, certainly over the more than century that we've been around, and you win some and you lose some. But I think that one of the things is that the blizzard of these executive orders are causing people to have to expend multiple resources to go to court to challenge these things that simply aren't within the ambit of the presidency. And they leave people with an impression that somehow the president has more authority than he actually has. I think that's one thing. I think the second thing that we're beginning to see, which is a little more dangerous, is, you know, you take something as unlawful as the use of the Alien Enemies Act, which the ACLU has challenged regarding the deportation of people to El Salvador. And the minute that the administration gets a ruling against it, number one, the president begins to criticize the judge, and then Republicans start talking about how they want to, you know, redo the federal judiciary. They didn't seem to want to do that when judges put in place nationwide injunctions against something from previous administrations, but suddenly that's a threat to democracy. And so I think that you can't look at these in just the normal order of the way that courts work. There is an attempt to sort of to put all the power of the federal government into the hands of one person, and then make all of us respond and operate based on his whims and his grievances. And I think that's really where the danger comes in a lot of these orders that we're seeing.
And you talked about you called it a blizzard. And I'm curious from that perspective as well. What's it like for an organization that prides itself on, you know, going to government, trying to hold it in check on civil liberties, that you would have this many cases to worry about?
I think there's a couple of things about that. Number one, it's tiring. It's not going to tire us out, but it is exhausting. Number two, I think we really rely on other organizations to be, you know, to be watchful, to be mindful, and to be part of the process of pushing back against these. That has been, you know, certainly the case over the last 2 months with the EOs that we've seen. But I think the other thing that it demands is a certain level of focus. And that was, you know, sort of in your last question, you know, you sort of hinted at this, which is, We could look just at the orders on immigration, and we can look just at the orders on trans rights, and we can look just at the orders on voting. We can look just at the orders that attack law firms and lawyers. The real effort here is to try to fundamentally upend our system of government. The real effort here is to try to make Donald Trump a king. And I think that for many of us, I think one of the things is having the discipline not to get lost in every single issue, even though we know that people are being harmed by many of these orders that the president is unleashing, but to frankly stay focused on the fact that we do not want to turn away from the democratic system, which is the only way in which rights, laws, and our economy has ever advanced. Where the rule of law doesn't exist, you don't see individual rights. Where the rule of law doesn't exist, you don't see strong economies. What you see are dictatorships that are organized to serve either the interest of the leaders or those around the leader. And that's really the discipline that we're having to bring to all of this, is to keep that big picture in mind as we challenge this.
Well, Ed, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Cole.
We'll be right back.